2 men and a forklift got the machine as far as the doorway of the old science hall and then stopped, because the machine was 11 inches wider than the door. They measured it twice. They took the handrail off the wall. They pulled the door and the frame out of the opening and swept the broken plaster into the corner with a push broom, and it was still 11 inches. Then one of them said the thing everybody at that sale repeated for the next 2 days, which was that somebody must have built the building around it. He was closer to right than he knew, and it took a year and a half before anybody worked out how. It was the second Saturday of October 2017 at St. Bede College in Ferrin, Missouri. A small church school that had graduated its last class in 2016 and sold its 14 acres to a developer who wanted the ground and nothing standing on it. The auction company had 8 buildings to empty in 9 days. Lawn mowers, kitchen equipment, 400 oak chairs, a chapel organ, 3 trucks and a snowplow, all of it dragged out onto the grass in numbered rows. Everything came out onto the lawn except Lot 74. Lot 74 stayed in the basement in a windowless room at the bottom of the science hall that the catalog called the vault. It sat on a slab of concrete that came up through the floor and did not touch the floor anywhere, a square gray island with a black gap all around it that you could drop a pencil into. Standing on that island was 3 tons of iron, 9 feet tall to the top of the frame. The shape of it is hard to place if you have never seen one. 4 cast columns leaning inward to a heavy cap and hanging in the middle of them hung upside down from the top. A cylinder of solid iron the size of a water heater and weighing 2,200 pounds. 2 arms came off the frame to a pair of air cylinders, like the closers on a screen door if a screen door weighed a ton. And out in front, on a bracket, a brass drum 15 inches across with a crank and a clockwork under it, and a light steel arm reaching over to touch the drum with a needle. The catalog listed it in 6 words: scientific instrument, iron, sold where is. It was a seismograph. It had been built in 1913 in Germany, shipped in crates, and set up in that basement to write down the shaking of the ground under southeast Missouri, which is a part of the country that has more history of shaking than most people who live there care to think about. The drum turned once every hour. The paper on it was smoked black over a flame. So the needle wrote a clean, bright line by scratching the soot away, and at the end of each day a man came down and lifted the sheet off and dipped it in varnish to fix it, and dated it and put it in a box. He did that, and the men who came after him did that, from 1913 until the station closed in 1974. Nobody at the preview knew any of that. What they knew was that it was heavy, that it was in a basement, and that it was 11 inches wider than the only way out. People went down the stairs to look at it anyway, because that is what people do at a sale. And they made jokes, which is also what people do at a sale, and I want you to hold on to the jokes, because in this story, the jokes are the evidence. One man said it was a still, and that a church school with a still in the basement explained a lot. One said it was a clock that had given up. A woman said it looked like something that ought to have a coin slot on it. And a scrap buyer in a canvas coat put his light on the legs, then on the cap, and said the line that ended up doing more work than any expert did. He said, "Look at this thing. It is 2 machines bolted together." And it was. The 4 legs were painted a hard industrial gray, and the cap and the mass above them were black, and the black was old and thin, and the gray was thick and modern and had run in one place. The arm that carried the needle was flat steel bar with file marks on the edges made by a person in a shop, on a machine that was otherwise all castings and machined faces. 3 of the 4 brackets holding the air cylinders were identical, and the 4th was not. And the big mass sat about 2 inches proud of its collar, on a ring of shim steel that somebody had cut with tin snips. Everybody in that basement saw the same 4 things. They saw them, and they laughed, and they went back up the stairs, and every one of those 4 things was worth money, and the man who eventually paid for them paid $132,000. The man who bought it that morning is named Byron Tindle. If you've made it this far into Byron's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He was 58 years old and had been buying and clearing the contents of closed buildings for 26 years, out of 4 counties, mostly with a gooseneck trailer and a nephew. He was not a collector. He had no interest in old iron as such. He had spent 11 years on boiler and pump work before that, and the thing that caught him in that basement was not the machine at all. It was the concrete. Somebody had gone to the trouble in 1913 of pouring a pier that came up through the floor of a building and did not touch it. That is expensive. Nobody does that by accident. Whatever stood on that pier, somebody had wanted it to feel the ground and nothing else, and Byron Tindle stood there long enough to work that out and then went upstairs to see what it would take. What it took was $25. The auctioneer started him at $500 and got nothing. He came down to $250 and got nothing, and made a joke about the freight and came to $100 and then $50 and then said, "Fine, $25. Somebody give me $25 and it is your problem now." One hand went up in a crowd of about 90 people. There was a laugh, and somebody clapped, and the auctioneer said, "Sold," and God help you getting it out of there. Getting it out took 3 weeks and cost him $1,900, which is 76 times what he paid for the machine, and that arithmetic followed him around for the next year and a half every time anybody asked about it. But it was during the getting out that he found the first real thing. The wall of that basement room was concrete block, and the plan was to knock a hole in it and drag the machine out sideways onto a ramp. Byron went down with a hammer to sound the wall for pipe, and about 6 feet from the corner the hammer changed its note. There was a panel there about 5 feet wide and 7 feet high, made of a different block, in a different mortar, and the mortar was a lighter color and stood a little proud of the face where somebody had struck it flat with a trowel and not gone back over it. It was a filled-in opening. It had been closed a long time, but nowhere near as long as the building had been standing. He took the panel out in about 40 minutes instead of the day it would have taken him to cut new block, and he took 9 photographs of it before he did, for no reason he could have explained, except that he had noticed it, and he does not leave a thing like that alone. There was one more thing in that room, still clamped on the brass drum. Dry and curled at the edges and black with old soot under varnish was a single sheet of paper about 3 feet long. The last one. Somebody had taken the machine out of service in 1974 and had never come back for the sheet on the drum. Byron cut the clamps, rolled it, and carried it up the stairs in a mailing tube. On that sheet were about 24 lines of scratched-out soot running side by side, one for each hour, and they were nearly flat, because most days the ground under Missouri does nothing at all. But at the left-hand end of one line there was a mark that was not flat. It was a small square-shouldered kick, up and back down, and then a set of little bounces getting smaller, about as long as your thumbnail. It looked deliberate. It looked like the machine had cleared its throat. He put the tube on a shelf in the shed. It sat there for 8 months. Remember it. Now, he had a 3-ton machine in a shed and no idea what to do with it, so he did what he always does, which is take pictures of everything and start writing letters. And here is where I want to hand you something. Because if you are ever standing in front of a machine that nobody at the sale can name, there are 3 things that will tell you more than any maker's plate. The first is what it is bolted to. The second is what has been replaced on it. And the third, if you are very lucky, is what it wrote. Byron had all 3 and did not know it. The first answer came from a graduate assistant at a university 200 miles away who wrote back in 2 lines and said, "That is an static seismograph. Please do not scrap it. I am forwarding this." The second call came 50 minutes later from a research seismologist at the State Geological Survey named Eni Sandoval, and she did not say hello. She said, "Is the release stop still on it?" Byron said he did not know what that was. She said, "Small bracket, low down on the front of the frame, a hardened screw through it, probably painted over." He walked out to the shed with the phone and found it in about 30 seconds, and she was quiet long enough that he asked if the line had dropped. To understand why a woman 3 hours away went quiet over a painted screw, you have to know what the survey had in its basement, which was 71 cardboard boxes containing 14,000 sheets of smoked paper from St. Bede College. Donated by the school in 1976, when nobody there wanted them anymore. Every one of them dated. Every one of them indexed on cards. 61 years of the ground moving under a part of the country that engineers lie awake about, written down by hand, and all of it useless. Useless because a line on a piece of soot is not a measurement. A seismograph is a lever. The ground moves a little, and the needle on the drum moves a lot, and the number of times more is called the magnification. If you know the magnification, then a scratch 6 millimeters tall is a real amount of ground movement, and you can put a size on the earthquake that made it. If you do not know the magnification, a scratch 6 millimeters tall is a squiggle and 14. 0 dome sheets of squiggles are just paper. The number everybody had used for those sheets for 40 years came out of the manufacturer's 1912 catalog. It said 200. Nobody had ever checked it against the machine because the machine had been sold to a scrap man for $25 and nobody at the survey knew it still existed. And this was not an academic matter that year. 2 separate outfits needed those old sheets. A utility was in the middle of re-evaluating a concrete dam built in 1929 on a river 60 miles from Ferrin, and a pipeline company was doing the same exercise on a crossing, and both of them had to answer the same question, which is how hard has the ground here actually moved in the last 100 years. Everything after 1974 is on modern instruments and is not in doubt. Everything before 1974 in that county is those boxes. There was a filing date 22 months out. Sandoval drove down on a Tuesday in February 2018 with a colleague and a tape measure, and Byron opened the shed doors. She walked around it twice without saying anything and then said what the scrap buyer had said in the basement. Only she did not laugh when she said it. She said, "This has been rebuilt." Byron said, "That is what everybody kept telling me." He gave her the 9 photographs of the filled-in panel, and she gave them to a colleague who spent an afternoon in the college's building file, which had gone with the rest of the paperwork to a county historical society. It took him 1 afternoon. In March of 1948, the Science Hall had settled on its northeast corner, The vault pier had cracked across, and the college had paid a contractor to open the outside wall, take the instrument out in pieces, break out the old pier, pour a new one, and put the machine back. That is why the machine was 11 inches wider than the door. The machine never came in through the door. It came in through a hole in the wall in 1913, and it went out and came back in through that same hole in 1948, and after that they bricked it up, and for the next 26 years the only way in was a doorway that the machine could not have fit through. And when they put it back together in 1948, somebody made a new needle arm out of flat bar and shimmed the mass and hand-filed a bracket and painted the legs gray and did not write down a single thing about any of it, which meant the number in the 1912 catalog stopped being true in March of 1948, and everybody kept using it until 2018. That is the second of the three things closing on him, if you are keeping count with me. What has been replaced on a machine is not damage. It is a date. For about 5 weeks that spring, this story was on rails. A university consortium, the survey's own foundation, and one of the engineering firms were talking about buying the machine between them, moving it to the survey building, re-erecting it on a new pier next to the boxes, and measuring it. A figure of $132,000 was in a draft agreement. Byron, who had paid $25 and $1,900 and had a machine in his shed that he could not have given away 6 months earlier, started to believe it. Then the consortium hired a consultant. His name was Gerald Burdett. He was retired. He had spent 31 years with scientific instruments, and there was nothing wrong with him. He came to the shed in April, spent 6 hours, and wrote 2 pages. And the 2 pages were the worst thing that happened in this story. He wrote that the frame carried no serial number anywhere he could find. He wrote that the recording arm was not a factory part, that the damping brackets were mismatched, that the mass was shimmed out of its designed seat, and that, in his opinion, the instrument as it now stood was an undocumented configuration. And then he wrote the sentence that ended it. He wrote that constants measured on this machine in 2018 could not be attributed to the recording period, because there was no way to establish that the machine had stood in this configuration on any given date in the past, which is fair. That is exactly the right objection. If you rebuild a lever and nobody writes down what you did, then measuring the lever 70 years later tells you about today. The agreement came apart in 9 days. The engineering firm went a different way and paid for a study based on felt reports instead. Burdett, who was not being cruel, offered Byron $1,500 for the machine himself to stand in a lobby. That was the low part of it. It ran from May into the fall. His brother-in-law told him to cut it up, and he priced that out, and 3 tons of cast iron at the yard that year came to about $310. He had a shed he could not use, a wife who had stopped asking, and a tube on a shelf with an old piece of soot in it. It got worse than that, because 2 pages travel. Once a consultant has written that an instrument is an undocumented configuration, that sentence goes in a file and it gets forwarded. And the next person who asks about the machine reads the sentence before they ever see the machine. Sandoval kept the boxes on her own shelves that summer instead of sending them back down to the general stacks, and she was straight with him about why. A survey basement with 71 boxes of paper in it that nobody can use is 71 boxes waiting for somebody's space audit. Paper like that does not get thrown out because somebody decides it is worthless. It gets thrown out because nobody left in the building can say what it is for. In November, he took the tube down. He had been thinking, without getting anywhere, about the second of those three things I told you to look at, which is what has been replaced. Everything Burdett had written was about replaced parts. But there was one part on that machine that nobody had replaced, and Byron had already been asked about it by name on the telephone before he had ever heard of Gerald Burdett. The release stop. Here is what it is, and it is beautifully simple. Down on the front of the frame there is a bracket with a hardened screw through it. You wind that screw in, and it pushes the 2,200-pound mass sideways by a fixed amount, and it stops on a machined shoulder so it is always the same amount. Then you flick a catch, and the mass is let go, and the machine rings and settles, and the needle writes it down. An operator was supposed to do that on the 1st of every month. It is how you check that the instrument is still alive and still honest. That little square-shouldered kick on the sheet in the mailing tube, the one that looked like the machine clearing its throat, was the release stop. It is the machine's signature written by the machine on the paper in its own hand, dated. Byron called Sandoval and asked her one question. He asked whether that mark was on other sheets. It was on 611 of them, the first of nearly every month from 1913 to 1974, sitting in those boxes, ignored by everybody for 40 years as an operator's housekeeping mark. That is the third thing, what it wrote. And it turns out the most valuable line that machine ever put on paper was not an earthquake at all. And now think about what that gives you. Because when Sandoval walked it through on the phone, Byron sat down on the shed step and stayed there. The screw and the shoulder are original iron. They are the one part of the machine that has never been touched. And they deliver the exact same push in 2018 that they delivered in 1913. So take the machine, set it up, wind the screw, let it go, measure what the needle writes, and measure what the mass actually did. That gives you the magnification of the machine as it stands today absolutely in numbers. Then go to the boxes. Measure the height of that same kick on the paper on 611 dates across 61 years. You do not need to know anything about the machine to do that. You just need a ruler. And because the push was always the same, the height of the kick tells you the magnification on every one of those dates as a ratio against the one you just measured. Burdett's objection was that nobody could establish what the machine was doing on a given date in the past. The machine had been establishing exactly that, in soot, on the 1st of every month for 61 years, and mailing it to the future. They measured it in January 2019 in the survey's own building on a new pier over 3 days. The magnification of that machine, rebuilt as it stood from 1948 onward, is 71. The catalog said 200. Then they went to the boxes. From 1913 to February 1948, the release kick on the paper stands 2, 4 times taller than the kick the machine makes now, which puts the original instrument at about 170, near enough to the catalog to be forgiven. In March 1948, the kick drops in 1 step on the first sheet after the contractor's invoice. And from April 1948 to the last sheet in 1974, it is flat. It never moves again. That step is the rebuilt needle arm. That flat line afterward is proof that nothing else was ever changed, which is the one thing Burdett said could not be shown. So for 26 years, every earthquake that station recorded had been read off as though the needle multiplied the ground 200 times, when it was multiplying it 71 times, which means the ground had actually moved about 2. 8 times more than the record was credited with every time for 26 years. 1,180 events came out of those boxes and were resized. Most of them are small and nobody cares. But the shock of 1965 that the catalog carries at 3.8 is a 4.3, and there are 4 more like it, and when you feed 61 years of corrected numbers into the recurrence work for that region instead of 35 good years and 26 bad ones, the numbers on the engineering side move. The dam study was reopened, the pipeline crossing was redone. In March of 2019, the machine sold for $132,000, paid by 3 parties who had never sat in the same room, and $25 of that was profit on the iron, and the rest was profit on 611 marks that everybody who ever handled that paper had looked straight past. Byron put one condition in writing. The machine stands in the same building as the boxes on the public floor, and anybody who wants to may come and wind the screw and watch it go. That condition cost him money 4 months later when a corporate science center offered $150,000 to take it 900 miles away and stand it behind glass in a lobby. He said no, and he has never been anything like sentimental about iron. And the reason he gave is the only kind of reason this man gives. He said the machine is not the exhibit. The machine and the paper together are the exhibit, and you cannot put half a measurement in a lobby. So look at the 3 things again, because he had all of them from the first morning. What it was bolted to was a pier poured separately through a floor, which is why he bid it all. What had been replaced was a needle arm, 4 brackets, a shim, and 2 coats of paint, which is what the scrap buyer laughed at and what the consultant later used to bury it. And what it wrote was a mark the size of a thumbnail on the 1st of every month for 61 years. The man in the canvas coat in that basement had it right the first time and did not know he had it. He said it was 2 machines bolted together. That is precisely what it was worth $132,000 for being.